pure and gold. If we hope and trust Him each day, we shall have pleasure untold.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you for being here this morning. So we had gotten a message from Larry Parsons this morning, and just a quick update that Johnny Sue was going to be out of ICU, but they didn't have a room. So they're thinking that they may have a room for about noon today. And so then she will be out of ICU. And then there's a procedure that they'll need to do, I guess tonight, or probably tonight. And then they're supposed to be able to head home tomorrow. Is the last word that we got from Larry. So we'll mention that again, I'm sure, during the service as well. Also received information from the school. Every year they have a Veterans Day program at the elementary school, and that's going to be Friday, November the 11th. If you're usually going to that, if you'd like to go, they've invited everyone that would like to participate. That's Friday, November 11th at 9 o'clock at the Boonville Elementary School cafeteria, and we'll put this up on the bulletin board out in the foyer as well. Our study this morning deals with probably one of the most well-known and even something that people have tried to imitate is Jesus walking on the water. There was a magician, I guess, illusionist, years ago that tried to imitate that. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry, Judy. I'm going to leave these right here so somebody else comes in. And so, what do you think is such a sort of draws your attention to Jesus walking on the water? Why is it that's they've even got a I know when they advertise the Sight and Sound Theater show in Branson, that's sort of the theme, is Jesus reaching down and pulling Peter up out of the water. So what is so sort of pulls us in, that idea of Jesus walking on the water, do we think? It's an impossible thing to do. Right? Anything else you want? Yes. It does away with what Richard's bringing up, the law of gravity. I'm not a swimmer at all, and the law of gravity pulls very hard on me if I get in the water, just to keep my head up out of the water. And so to add to that, and this is what these illusionists, when they try to mimic that, we're not able to do, is we're told that when Jesus did this, what was happening on the Sea of Galilee at that time? There was a storm coming up, and then when we look at the passages that's involved, and in your handouts this morning, you've got a Harmony of the Gospel chart that shows us 3 different gospel accounts of this particular thing that's taking place. And got the Sea of Galilee, you've got the storm that's happening, and then this is all happening from 3 o'clock in the morning to 6 in the morning, during the 4th watch of the night, they call it. So, and then sort of what I started thinking of, going back and thinking about everything that has happened on this day. So let's think about that just a moment. So when we started our study a couple of weeks ago, Jesus and the disciples had just found out that John the baptizer had been beheaded, and that news got back to Jesus, and he wanted to go somewhere secluded for a short time. His apostles, his disciples had just come back, and they were reporting everything that had happened with them as he sent them out on their own to do some of the very things that he has trained them to do. And so they set out to go across the Sea of Galilee. It's about 8 miles wide, this particular area, when you think about where Capernaum is at. And then going over to Bethsaida, which is on the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee, probably about maybe 7 miles, 6 miles. It's not the widest part, but you've got Capernaum, you've got Bethsaida, you've got the location of the Sermon on the Mount, and then last week we studied about feeding of the 5,000 men plus the women and children. We were estimating it could be anywhere from 12 to 15,000 total. And so all of these things have taken place in this short period of time. And just getting across the Sea of Galilee was no easy task. I mean, you just didn't start up your motorboat and head across the lake. I mean, you were either using the sails or you were rowing with oars in these heavy wooden boats. And so they got across the other side to try to have a secluded time. There were people everywhere, a crowd. It was close to the end of the day. Jesus decided that we're going to feed this multitude of people, and we studied about that and everything that was involved, the space that was involved. And so in our study this morning, and we'll read the passage, the three passages that we have is found in Matthew, Mark, and John. And you look at your Harmony of the Gospel chart, as I mentioned. And so it pulls all this thing together. Now remember, as we think about the Gospel accounts, sometimes people will look at them, as we've mentioned, and they think, well, this account doesn't match what this account has, so there's contradiction there. So what are we saying? We take the four Gospel accounts as what? A total picture. We put everything together, and this chart does that very well. It puts these things together. There's a few things that John will include that's not in Matthew Mark's account. There's some things that Matthew and Mark has that's not in John's account. Luke doesn't even record anything on it, but there's reasons we've talked about many times before of why Matthew wrote the Gospel account the way he did. Mark had a reason for why he wrote it the way he did. Luke did, and John did as well. So there was reasons and targeted crowds that those Gospel accounts were written to. And so all of them put together for us makes sense for us. We want to know all of that. And so let's look at Matthew 14. Let's read the account of Matthew. It begins in verse 22. Immediately, now this is right after the feeding of the multitude. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him. He wanted, for some reason, the disciples wanted them to not be there. He wanted them to go on ahead, get in the boat, and go to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. And remember, this is sort of the whole idea of them coming across anyway, was to find a secluded place so that he could pray, and when he got there, the crowd was there. So he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it. All right. Now let's look at Mark's account. Mark 6. That begins in verse 45. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Now, I was trying to make sense of these locations. Bethsaida is the location where they went to begin with, and this is where the crowd had gathered. And so remember that he had gone up on a mountain to pray. There had to be a grassy area that was large enough for this multitude of people to be there for the feeding of that group. And so it could be that this place was not in the middle of town by any means. It was probably outside of Bethsaida somewhere. And so Bethsaida would be the place where they had moored their boat when they came across to begin with. So he's told them to go back, go to the boat. And maybe he sort of left the impression, or maybe they thought that he was going to follow and be there shortly after that. So he went up on a mountainside to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land, and he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. All right, so that brings us up sort of the same place on both. Now, when we look at John's account, in John 6, beginning in verse 15, when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum, which was sort of on the other side of that upper area of the Sea of Galilee. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him to the boat. Immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Now, right before all of this, and John records this, but not Matthew and Mark, of trying to think, why did Jesus, let's say, there's a couple of things. Why did he send the disciples on in front of him? He still wanted to try to find some time to seclude himself and to pray. And John adds this at the end of the feeding of the 5,000 in verse 14. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." They're sort of putting pieces together here, making some connections of what Jesus is doing, what he's teaching, who he is. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. He gives us a little bit more information before this happens as far as him going up on the mountain. So, not too long before this, he had been in Nazareth. He had been in his own hometown. And what happened there? Rejected him. And here, he's got this multitude of people, and he has fed them, and they're sort of starting, like we said, putting the pieces together. Now what do they want to do? They want to make him a king. What kind of king? That's the question. They wanted to make him their physical king. That's what their idea was of who God was going to be sending. It was going to be a physical king. We've talked about this many times. So try to put ourselves in the place here of trying to see what is going on in the environment that Jesus finds himself. You got those of his hometown who's rejected him. You got a bunch of crowds that have come out and he's fed them, and now they want to make him king by force. He knows their hearts by force. And he sends the disciples, said, "Y'all go on in front of me." And the thought is that because of John's account and the information that he provides to us in these accounts, is that Jesus didn't want his disciples necessarily there when all of this commotion was going on. So let's move forward just a moment. I got thinking, well, why would he think this? And so let's move forward. What happened in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus had finished praying and the soldiers came to take him? How did his disciples react then? Yes. Some of them ran away. Peter pulled out his sword. I mean, it's just sort of chaotic. And so anytime that we've looked at these times where Jesus is with his disciples and things are happening, things get chaotic after a while because you've got different people having these different thoughts and ideas going on about who Jesus is, who he's not, what he's done, what they want him to do, and it's just chaotic. Jesus and his disciples had left from Capernaum when Herod started paying attention to Jesus. John the Baptizer had been killed. He knew that. He thought that what he was hearing about Jesus was, well, maybe John has come back from the dead. And so he wants to find out more about these things. And the idea is to feel you feel the tension starting to really rise all around this area. Everyone knows about him, things that he's doing, many who don't like him, many who wants to make him king, and you get this, how many different directions can you be torn with all this going on? So, that's in our background. So now, as we go through the scene that we're looking at here, Jesus has his disciples go on. He goes on the mountainside to pray. He looks from the shore and sees, even though that it says that they've gone 3 or 3.5 miles. If I were here and could I see halfway from here to Magazine? I probably could on a lake, couldn't I? Or if he was still on the mountain. One account says he was on the shore too, but it could be elevated. And so, you could probably tell that there was a storm going on, and what other boats would be out on the Sea of Galilee at 3 o'clock in the morning? And so he sees that they're in danger, and so he starts out going to them, walking on the water during a storm. And one commentator looks at this, how would this look? I mean, in a storm, what do the waves do? It's like this. Wind is blowing terribly. Waves are going up. And so, Jesus walking on the water, we would see Jesus here, and then he'd down between the waves. Up. You see, he was walking right on the water, just like we were walking over ground that had hills and knolls on it. And so, his disciples, they're still awake. Why? They're fighting the storm. I mean, it's been a long day. And they've set out. They're fighting the storm. The wind is against them, so they're not using their sails. They're using their oars. I don't know how many times maybe you've been in a boat with oars and the wind's in front of you pushing this way. It's not very easy, is it? It seems like you row twice, go back once. And you row twice, you go back once. So they're fine. Jesus walks out to where they are. One account says, passing by, they think that the Greek words mean he's coming alongside where they are. I don't think he had intended. He's just going to walk on by and leave them where they are. But what happens? They see him. And if you look at your questions, let's get caught up just a minute. We've talked about the Jewish concept of becoming the Messianic king and his kingdom. That's question number 1. Was totally different than what God intended as far as Jesus. What did the crowd want to do with Jesus after he fed the multitude according to John's account? Make him king, physical king, in that Messianic kingdom sense of a physical king. Number 3, what were some of the Jewish misconceptions about the kingdom. We've talked about that many times. What is the meaning of the fourth watch? That is from 3 in the morning to 6 o'clock. Asked Mom this morning, what time did you get up? 3 o'clock. She was on her fourth watch this morning, and she was waiting on us when we pulled up to pick her up at church. So she was up during that very early morning part. This is where the boat is out on the storm on the lake, Sea of Galilee. And number 5, what did the disciples say about Jesus as he was walking on the sea? What did they think? A ghost. I don't know if they had seen a ghost out on the water before, and that's how they figured out that that's who it was or what it was. I don't know, but something they did not conceive that it was a human being out there, especially walking on the water. And what did Jesus do? Identified himself. It's me. I'm here. And so as we look through our chart, we go through the accounts. They saw him. They were afraid. Thought he was a ghost. He let them know that it's him. Calmed them down. And what happened in Mark and in the account when Jesus got into the boat, what happened to the storm? It calmed. Had they seen this before? Jesus had calmed the storm. He was sleeping in the boat. They were out there. They were about to perish. Master, the tempest is raging. And they wake him up. And he just tells everything, just hush and be still. So they'd seen that before. This time, he just got in the boat and the waves obeyed. Just calmed. Everything was calm. Now in Matthew's account, there's something added. There's something different than what we find in Mark and John. This is another one of those very familiar scenes for us, and it involves Peter. So let's look in Matthew again. In verse 28, after Peter figured out this is Jesus, Peter, as he is, said, Lord, if it's you. Sort of wonder, he speaks before he thinks. He speaks before he thinks sometimes. But wants to make sure that this was really Jesus. Peter replied, if it's you, Lord, tell me to come to you on the water. What did Jesus say? Come on. Step out of that boat. Come on here. Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Now, what do we usually apply to this? In this scene of Peter stepping out of the boat, doing fine, walking on the water, as long as what? He keeps his eyes on Jesus. He's fine. But when Peter started to look around and everything else that was going on, this is still with the stormy seas going on here. Jesus had not gotten the boat yet. Then he started to sink. And so we make application to that is that as long as we keep our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, then we can continue to, so to speak, walk on the water, even though it's impossible to the world. And yet, when we take our eyes off Jesus, we become so involved with all the storms and the winds waves and everything else that comes up in life, and that's when our faith begins to waver. And Jesus says, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt? So here, as Richard has mentioned, the walking on the water shows Jesus' power over nature. What did he have just done? And this is important because the disciples, it tells us here in a moment that they're not catching on. They're not grasping all of the things that's happening. Even with the feeding of the multitude. They're not grasping. What was the power of that feeding of the multitude that Jesus brought? He was making something out of nothing. That's happened before. Jesus was there. What was that? Making something out of nothing. Jesus was there. Creation. Water to wine. Jesus knew all about that. He understands that. He was there. He is God's Son. And so, here we are. They're not grasping the power over nature. Just the whole concept of who Jesus is in the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. And so, you of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, and this sort of sticks in my mind, after everything that they've gone through, why are they saying, truly, you are the Son of God? I would have thought by now that they would have understood that. But Jesus just keeps amazing, adding to his majesty and his power, his presence, every step of the way, where they think they've got it all figured out, and yet something else happens that sort of, just sort of opens everything up again. Truly you are the Son of God. Alright, so let's see on our chart and see where we're at. In Matthew's account, Peter walked on the water, he became frightened, he began to sink. Jesus saved him. On the backside, Jesus, again, ye of little faith. They got into the boat, the wind stopped. They're admitting that you are definitely God's Son in Matthew's accounts. Now, in Mark's account, there's something that we want to take a look at in, verse... it's in verse 51 of Mark chapter 6. Then he climbed into the boat with them. So we're up to that point. And the wind died down. They were completely amazed. Matthew's account, truly you are the Son of God. But what does Mark say in verse 52? They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Something about, as we mentioned, the creation of the loaves out of nothing. They had not completely grasped how big of a thing that was, how incredible that was. All they were doing was, and I sort of look at this as staying busy. Sometimes we get so busy that we fail to see exactly what's going on around us. So we get so busy and caught up. What their job was to keep that food going. Jesus was providing the food, and all they were doing was filling up the baskets and taking it out and feeding it to those groups of 50 and those groups of 100 that were scattered around over that size of about 3 football fields, trying to make sure that everybody gets fed. It was late in the evening. It was probably getting dark. They needed to get them out of there and go home and be dismissed. Some of them were starting to think, man, Jesus, we've got to make him our king. Look at all these things that he's doing and all this commotion going on. And they missed of what had actually happened. And their hearts were hardened. They had not learned anything from the incident of the loaves, and they were astonished, one translation says. So, one translation says, one account says, that when Jesus got into the boat, got everybody calmed down, that they were automatically, it's almost like they were transported in a sense, according to the wording, to Gennesaret. The other accounts was they went ahead and made their way on. Now, I couldn't find, I looked in the back of my New Testament in the maps and others, and I couldn't find exactly where is Gennesaret. We think they were heading, in this little map here, it's hard to see, but if you're trying to picture, if you have a map in your Bible, the Sea of Galilee, the top part of it where Bethsaida was, over on this side, on the northeast corner, Bethsaida, that's where the feeding of the 5,000 plus took place. They got into the boat. They started heading back over to the other side. Perhaps they were going to head towards Capernaum, which was west of there. Gennesaret is a spot just a little bit farther down the shore from Capernaum. And that's where they landed. That's where they came, Gennesaret. So it was probably, I don't know, maybe about 5 miles. If 8 miles across is what the Sea of Galilee is, they probably went about 5 miles, something like that. The storm happened. He came to them about halfway across that part of the water, body of water across the top there. And so when they landed there, what happened? He was recognized. And whenever Jesus is recognized during this particular time, what happens? Yes. Crowds start gathering again, just like what they had just gone through. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 34, when they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all of that surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak. All who touched him. This goes again. When in the times that Jesus has healed people, he didn't have to be right there. Sometimes he was, where he would put mud on a person's eyes, touch, and heal. There would be those times that he would actually go to the house and he would just speak, "Little girl, Tabitha, rise up." There'd be those times that he would just tell someone, "Go to your home because your loved one is well." And now we have the time that they were believing that all they had to do is if they could just touch the hem of his garment. And this happened also with the woman that had the blood disorder, 12 years, just grabbing at his garment, and he felt power go from him. He knew who it was, but he was testing his disciples and asking, "Well, who touched me in this crowd?" Out of that crowd, there was one person that had faith, believed that if I can just grab a hold of his garment and touch the garment, then I'll be healed. Perhaps some of these people had heard of that, and they believed that if I can just touch the bottom of his cloak or his garment, that I can be healed, and that very thing was taking place. And so, again, all these things that are going on with Jesus. Let's see if there was anything else. That pretty well completed the three gospel accounts of what was going to take place. In Matthew's account next week, as we continue our study in chapter 15, we have the Pharisees and the teachers again. Jesus and his disciples are breaking the rules. So they're going to be dealing with that again as well. As we go through this, and we continue to think about everything that's going on around Jesus and his disciples and all the other people that's involved. You're seeing, and we're seeing, that you've got the group that's still ramping up their efforts to stop Jesus, leading up to his crucifixion. You have those groups of people that are flocking towards Jesus because they know that he can heal them. You have his disciples and those that are traveling with them who are witnessing all of these things, and they're understanding part of it and they're not sure about other parts of it. They know that there's something very special going on here, but they're not completely understanding where this is going. This is going to come to a point where there is going to be life and death decisions made, Jesus knowing what he has to do. And he's going to continue to try to protect his disciples, especially the apostles, and strengthen them and give them as much information and learning and the spirit that he's given them to help them understand. You're going to have to continue on. All this is for their learning and their training to continue on. You've got to continue fight this fight that's before you. And it is not, as Paul would say, our fight is not physical. We are not fighting physical things of the world, but we are fighting against those dark things of Satan. That's where our fight is. He's trying to teach his disciples those things. Any final comment from anyone as we close this morning? Thank you for your attention.